Good morning. My name is Keely Bakken, and I am a supervisory policy analyst at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal government body created by the International Freedom Act of 1998, or IRFA, to monitor religious freedom abroad and make policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress. So thank you all for joining us this morning for this discussion on threats to religious sites in Turkey. USCIRF has documented religious freedom violations in Turkey for more than a decade, and for the last 4 years, we have recommended that the U.S. Department of State place Turkey on the State Department's special watch list for its severe violations of freedom of religion or belief. Many of the Turkish government's violations of this right are long-running practices, such as its refusal to grant legal personality to religious communities, its blocking of the reopening of the Theological School of Halki or Halki Seminary, and prevention of the opening of any other private theological establishment, and its regular interference in elections for religious leaders, among other violations. Religious sites in Turkey, including places of worship and cemeteries, are frequently the subject of vandalism, damage, and in some cases destruction, which the government in turn has either failed to prevent, declined to punish, or been complicit in. In recent years, USCIRF has urged the State Department to more closely track and document the efforts of religious communities to open, regain, renovate, and protect their places of worship and other religious sites across the country. So with the publication of USCIRF's latest report titled An Examination of Threats to Religious Sites in Turkey, we hope that this document and discussion will shed light on the extent and diversity of these concerns and contribute to much needed US efforts to promote freedom of religion or belief in Turkey. So to help guide this morning's conversation, I am joined by two USCIRF commissioners, David Curry and Susie Gelman, and I will now turn it over to Commissioner Curry to share his thoughts.
Thank you, Keely, and special thanks to our guest who's here today. This is a subject of particular interest to me, having been to Turkey and seen many important historical religious sites as well as other sites. The situation for religious freedom in Turkey has a complicated history, to be sure, as traditionally they have sought to remove religion from the public sphere. The Turkish constitution has long defined the country as laic or secular and provided grounds for previous governments to restrict and control many elements of religious practice. For instance, the state directly oversees the practice of Islam through the Official Directorate of Religious Affairs, while the General Directorate of Foundations has managed the affairs of other religious minority communities. In the last 2 decades, however, we have seen that approach shift. President Erdogan has increasingly promoted his own religious views, that of Sunni Islam, and publicly expressed his desire to raise, quote, a pious generation, end quote. This focus has, of course, been exclusionary and served to marginalize Turkey's many religious minority communities. Certain displays of religious nationalism, such as the Turkish government's decision in 2020 to convert the Hagia Sophia from a museum back into an active mosque, similarly undermined interfaith relations and contributed to a sense among Turkey's non-Muslim religious minorities that they were increasingly unwelcome in their own homeland. We are pleased to see the inauguration of the Mor Ephraim Syriac Orthodox Church in Istanbul last month, and what many have called the first church to be officially constructed in the history of the Turkish Republic. But nonetheless, the government continues to pose significant barriers for religious minorities and their places of worship. Notably, the ruling party and its allies have largely refused to recognize Aliyev's, pardon me if I mispronounced that, I'm so sorry, the country's largest religious minority community as distinct from the Sunni Muslim majority. Officials have regularly rejected efforts to recognize Alevi gathering houses as places of worship and have charged them discriminatory utility fees that do not apply to other religious groups. Likewise, other religious minorities, such as Protestant Christians and Jehovah's Witnesses, have either struggled to gain recognition for or been denied permission to build churches and kingdom halls due to unfair zoning practices. At the same time, government negligence, vandals, and so-called treasure hunters have frequently threatened, damaged, or destroyed religious sites over the years. Recent USCIRF annual reports have detailed break-ins, arson attacks, and the razing of religious minority cemetery plots, and the vandalism of places of worship and personal homes with threatening or insulting messages. In one alarming case last year, vandals destroyed tens of headstones in a Jewish cemetery in Istanbul. In some instances, urban development projects have placed historical religious sites at risk. Still others have been demolished after enduring many years of neglect and disrepair at the hands of the government and local officials. I look forward to today's presentation on the findings of this report, and I hope that it can inform both U.S. policy and the Turkish governments on steps to better protect and preserve these important and invaluable sites. And with that, I would like to turn the attention over to my fellow commissioner, Susie Gelman. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Curry, and welcome again to our guest speaker. Religious minorities in Turkey often experience government discrimination, societal harassment, and, as we will discuss in more detail today, the destruction or vandalization of religious sites that are fundamental to their lives and identities. While it is encouraging to note an overall decline in the number of terrorist attacks that have targeted non-Muslim religious groups in Turkey, it is crucial that the government address the many other threats faced by these communities, their places of worship, and other religious sites. USCIRF was shocked last year when several individuals conducted a string of attacks on Alevi places of worship and associations in the capital of Ankara. These attacks coincided with the beginning of the holy month of Muharram, in which Alevis observe and consider sacred. One woman was hospitalized after she was stabbed. Just days later, an Alevi religious leader was beaten in the streets. Law enforcement reportedly apprehended only one individual involved in the initial spate of attacks. In many cases, authorities have contributed to a culture of impunity for such crimes by failing to prosecute assailants to the full extent of the law. But law enforcement and other authorities should treat these crimes seriously and respond to them with proportionate measures to punish perpetrators and discourage those who would follow their lead. Failing to appropriately prosecute such acts will only encourage their continuation. Other religious minority communities, predominantly Christians and Jews, have faced similar instances of societal violence and threats. During the pandemic in May 2020, a man attempted to set fire to an Armenian apostolic church in Istanbul because he absurdly blamed the community for bringing the coronavirus to Turkey. In September of that same year, after fighting broke out between neighboring Armenia and Azerbaijan over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkish ultra-nationalists surrounded the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul in a disturbing act of intimidation. In addition to the desecration of a Jewish cemetery already mentioned by Commissioner Curry, the Jewish community has also seen the gateway of an historical synagogue set on fire in recent years, while Catholic and Yazidi cemeteries have also been severely damaged or destroyed. It does not help that it is often the government itself that has stoked religious discrimination, intolerance, and anti-Semitism through polarizing rhetoric targeting both religious minorities and non-religious individuals as less than their peers and fellow citizens. Such rhetoric marginalizes these communities and risks encouraging hate crimes against them. While we welcome the Turkish government's steps to increase security for Jews and Jewish institutions following a global rise in anti-Semitism since Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel, It must do more to combat anti-Semitism, both within society and among its own ranks. We unequivocally condemn recent remarks made by a local official of the ruling party that praised Adolf Hitler and spoke of a day when the world would be, quote unquote, cleansed of Jews. The Turkish government must take a stand against such shocking examples of anti-Semitism and all other forms of hatred. Everyone should feel free to practice and worship in their places of worship without fear of attacks, intimidation, or other threats. I hope that today's conversation is one step toward making that a reality for religious communities in Turkey. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Keely.
Thank you, Commissioner Gelman and Commissioner Curry, for your remarks. So we are joined today by Dr. Tuba Tanyeri Erdemir, who is the author of this report and the coordinator of the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. She is also a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute and the co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Roundtable's Middle East Working Group. Dr. Tanyeri Erdemir's research focuses on minority rights in the Middle East, heritage management of sacred sites, converted and contested religious buildings, and reutilization and museumification of religious heritage. She has carried out extensive field research on religion and policy as part of numerous international interdisciplinary research projects, including antagonistic tolerance, a comparative analysis of competitive sharing of religious sites. I should also mention that in the research and writing of this report, Dr. Tanyeri Erdemir worked with a Turkey-based team who prefer to remain anonymous given the threats faced by scholars working on human rights and freedom of religion or belief issues in the country. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Tanyeri Erdemir.
Thank you. I would like to start by thanking USCIRF and its dedicated staff for funding this project and facilitating its report, which highlights the importance of documenting and understanding the nature of threats on religious sites, cemeteries, and religious institutions. In many ways, religious minorities are like the canary in the coal mine. The way they are treated is a good measure of the state of equal citizenship, pluralism, and social inclusion in any given country. Religious sites, cemeteries, and religious institutions are key sites to observe whether at-risk faith and belief communities can enjoy the same rights and freedoms as others. Documenting attacks on religious sites and the response from law enforcement agencies, or lack thereof, is a good indicator of the challenges that religious and non-believer communities face, and whether a polity has a culture of accountability or impunity. For this report, the project team visited, documented, and reported current conditions, threats, attacks, and other criminal issues for the preservation of religious sites, worship halls, and cemeteries in 7 provinces across Turkey, namely Bursa, Edirne, Elazığ, Diyarbakır, İzmir, Kayseri, Mardin, and Trabzon, covering a total of 80 sites belonging to or built by Alevi, Armenian Apostolic, Armenian Catholic, Bulgarian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Jewish Protestant, Sunni Muslim, Syriac Catholic, and Syriac Orthodox communities. The media survey covered 2 decades between 2002 and 2022 to identify and analyze the types of threats and attacks targeting religious sites. In addition, we conducted interviews with religious and non-believer communities. Our study, which includes majority and minority religious communities, as well as non-believer communities, allows us to compare the decrease or increase in the different types of attacks and threats targeting different communities and their sites. This report illustrates what types of attacks are common to all communities and the different types of attacks that each community, religious community suffered. The media survey indicated that over the last decade, there has been a significant uptick in the number of vandalism and physical attacks, either on the religious sites, cemeteries, or institutions themselves, or the communities that worship there. This marks a notable difference from the violent attacks of early 2000s, like the synagogue bombings in Istanbul in 2003. While there is a decrease in the number of such episodes of violent, deadly attacks, there is a marked increase in the number and frequency of vandalism, threats, destruction of property, and arson. In many cases, the authorities fail to prosecute a wide array of vandalism cases. This is either because the assailants are not identified, and in the cases in which they are apprehended, the authorities drop the charges if the assailants offer an apology, or they may receive minimum sentences or no sentence due to factors like their age, some of them are minors, or their mental state. It is also sometimes hard for the communities to properly report the crimes and demand for justice. Especially minority communities are cautious and sometimes even reluctant in reporting these crimes. Individuals may prefer not to report because of fears of ostracization, or that authorities will not take the crime or threat seriously, or as victims, they fear they might face further harassment and marginalization. In our media survey, we were able to show that only a small fraction of documented attacks, the assailants were caught. And among those, only 25% was reported in media to have received a sentence. One of the most prominent threats faced by non-Muslim and non-Sunni religious communities is the confiscation of their property by the state, which can take place gradually, occur as an act of retaliation by the government, or result from the government taking advantage of bureaucratic mishaps. The Armenian genocide of 1915 and the compulsory population exchange of 1923, which decimated the Armenian and Greek Orthodox communities respectively, left a significant number of churches, monasteries, cemeteries, schools, institutions, and revenue-generating properties without their constituents. Consequently, many rural churches and monasteries were left to decay, and unclaimed religious structures in urban areas were either demolished or converted for other uses. The confiscation of properties continued through the 20th century. In regions where non-Muslim minorities have been in steep decline, it has proved difficult for those communities to keep minority foundations active and to keep their records up to date. If a foundation is declared defunct, this opens a door for the government to confiscate properties and religious buildings of minority foundations. Such confiscation can be gradual and occur without the knowledge of the community. When the General Directorate confiscates non-Muslim religious sites and their revenue-generating properties, the ensuing decrease in revenue from such properties, which is crucial to fund security measures to protect religious sites, makes such sites more vulnerable to threats and attacks. Non-Sunni Muslim religious minorities in Turkey are already under a significant financial burden to serve their congregations, sustain their places of worship, and ensure their security. Caring for historical religious sites and keeping their foundations active, especially in regions where their numbers are in decline, or where there is no community left, can be untenable and daunting. In most cases, targeted neglect by the authorities compounds the damage to these historic structures and cemeteries. In the absence of government support, they face destruction or severe damage. One particular threat these religious sites are particularly susceptible to is treasure hunting. It is one of the most widespread, normalized, and destructive threats to non-Muslim historical religious sites and cemeteries across Turkey. The Turkish government's work to restore historical places of worship belonging to non-Muslim communities is beneficial in curbing threats and attacks, since these places then become hubs of positive interaction between majority and minority religious communities. This sort of interaction directly contributes to overcoming negative stereotypes, building empathy, and promoting pluralism. However, these restoration projects are too few at present to make such positive interactions sufficiently widespread across Turkish society. Monitoring, documenting, and understanding threats to religious sites is important, both in facilitating adequate responses to threats, but also ensuring ensuing freedom of belief and practice. It helps the preservation of religious institutions, practices, heritage, and contributes to building an inclusive ethos and cordial interfaith relations. In this important line of work, I would like to acknowledge Osman Kavala, who has a record of working tirelessly to document and preserve the cultural heritage of Turkey's minorities. It is heartbreaking to witness that Kavala's praiseworthy efforts not only failed to elicit the official recognition from the Turkish government, but also made him a target of one of the worst smear campaigns and legal harassment in Turkish political history. As of today, Kavala is sentenced to life without parole based on trumped-up charges, despite earlier rulings to his favor by Turkish courts and the European Court of Human Rights. Following this note, I would also like to acknowledge the fact that although my name is the only one published on this report, this was a team effort. I would like to thank my amazing colleagues in Turkey who prefer to remain anonymous given the threats faced by scholars working on human rights and freedom of religion or belief issues in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuba. That was a very helpful and comprehensive review of USCIRF's new report. And before I begin with a couple of questions, I'd like to first remind the audience that you can now begin to submit your own questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So just to start, and as you mentioned, Tuba, a significant finding of this report was the decline in the number and severity of these terrorist type attacks targeting places of worship. And Turkey had in the past witnessed incredibly serious attacks, such as the 2003 synagogue bombings that we've mentioned. How do you account for this change, and what role, if any, has the government played in preventing attacks of this nature? And why have we not seen a similar decline in the other types of threats faced by religious sites?
There are two different dynamics here. One of them is the fact that the Turkish government actually is very careful in monitoring threats of larger bombings or terrorism on religious sites. In our interviews with religious communities, we were told that in many cases, non-Muslim communities work closely with the police force in their area. And whenever there's a threat, the security forces inform them of this threat and take the necessary measures. And this kind of prevents the pattern of larger, violent, deadly attacks. On the other hand, the increase that we see in vandalisms, arson, breaking of property, attacking religious sites with stones, threatening congregations and things like that. There is a significant increase in these because these are the crimes that do not necessarily get the adequate attention and adequate sentencing. Again, one of the reasons for that is the communities themselves. They may feel insecure in reporting these crimes, but there's also another dimension. For instance, if a crime can be classified as a hate crime, and most of the crimes that we see on religious sites and places are by definition hate crimes, the assailant could get a sentence in jail for up to 12 years. But to get that classification for the crime, first, the communities have to be willing to really report the crime in the way that it will be defined. And there's also a role on the first responders, the police force. They may need more training in terms of realizing some of these crimes are hate crimes and dangerous. So there is this dynamic that ends up making vandalisms a lot more common. Of course, there is a culture of impunity that goes with those crimes too. And the more and more frequent those crimes take place, the less comfortable and safe the religious minority communities feel. So it also gets into a vicious cycle of fear and impunity.
Thank you for that. You know, the report also noted important differences in the types of threats faced by various religious communities and how attitudes towards them have also varied by region across Turkey. So why do we see such marked differences in the attacks that target, for instance, Alevis versus Protestants versus Armenian Apostolics? And specifically, why have Alevis' personal homes been so routinely subject to vandalism and graffiti? And what factors do you believe contribute to these geographic variations in terms of societal attitudes towards various religious minorities?
Let me start with the geographic variations. And we had a very interesting pattern. If you look at the numerical distribution of attacks, one would see that the Marmara region, where Istanbul is located, happens to have the most number of attacks. But there is an important factor in there. Marmara region is one of the regions that non-Muslims have almost most of their active places of worship. So there is a reason why such acts are a lot more concentrated in the Marmara region than elsewhere in Turkey. It also happens to be the most densely populated part of Turkey. So this kind of makes us understand the kind of the large number of attacks in there. However, when we look at, for instance, Central Anatolia and Black Sea, on the one hand, you see the number of attacks is less, but at the same time, you have to understand, understand that there are less non-Muslim communities living in these areas. And for instance, in the places that they are, some of them face really serious long-term threats. In one of the Black Sea coast cities, for instance, we recorded 17 different acts of threats or attacks on an individual in the region who was trying to set up his congregation. So there are, even though, for instance, the number might appear less in Central and Black Sea region, the underlying kind of strong nationalism, ultranationalism, and religious extremism in those regions account for the frequency of these attacks on certain religious groups. On the other hand, we of course have a slightly more number of attacks in the southeast region and Eastern Anatolian regions. These are the parts that have actually living Yazidi and Syriac populations. And that, on the one hand, the attacks account for attacks on these populations. But on the other hand, because of the mixed ethnic and religious fabric of these communities, the frequency of attacks are not as significant as we had seen in the Black Sea and Central Anatolian regions. So these are some of the patterns that we have observed in terms of geography. Let me get back to some of the types of attacks that different communities have faced. As you said, over the last 5 years, especially, the Alevi community have been facing a lot of targeted attacks in terms of marking their houses, and attacks in their places of worship. And this is across the geography, so it takes place in, it's not concentrated at one part of the country. And it is very frequent. And that is an alarming pattern. And one reason why this is so frequent is that the perpetrators are very rarely caught. And the perpetrators have impunity for, acting on this hate crime. So that is one of the things. The second group that has in our report that has suffered the most attacks is the Armenian Apostolic and Armenian Catholic communities. And most of the attacks occurred as attacks on their places of worship, vandalism and graffiti and things like that. And most of their places of worship are located in Istanbul, although there are other active churches across Turkey. And we have seen a very significant uptick in attacks on their places of worship. And of the Muslim populations, in addition to Alevis, the Jafiris, for instance, the Shiite population in Turkey have suffered arson cases, although few in number, significant in the pattern that those things took place.
So raising the issue of culture of impunity is a great transition to my next question. So the media survey that you and the team conducted indicated that only a very small fraction of individuals who perpetrate these attacks receive any kind of penalty. So in the cases that you analyzed, you found that 35% of perpetrators were identified, and of that 35%, only 25% receive an actual sentence. So how do you explain this apparent reluctance on the part of the government to fully investigate and prosecute these cases? And how do the affected religious communities perceive the government's lack of response?
The government's lack of response creates an environment of fear for religious communities. It's very intimidating to know that you can be attacked any given time, and the perpetrator, even if you identify the perpetrator with the security cameras that you have installed with your own funds, even if in the cases that you clearly identify the perpetrator, sometimes the perpetrators are asked to apologize for their acts. And the communities, in most cases, accept the apology because there are costs in not accepting this apology. And in the other cases, the perpetrators are either found to be not sane, their mental state is not they're found that their mental state is not does not allow them to get a sentence, or some of them are minors. So a lot of these cases have impunity, and this impunity given by the government promotes further cases like that across the country.
Right. I will ask one more question before we start to turn to our questions from the audience, because I see that they're starting to build up. So another interesting point that was emphasized in the report was that religious heritage sites face a distinctive threat in the form of treasure hunting and illicit excavations. So how do you account for the prevalence of this practice across Turkey, and why have the authorities also failed to respond to this type of threat?
This is even worse. In addition to impunity in these cases, some of these crimes are not even considered as crimes. It is very hard to catch the perpetrators on the one hand, because some of these attacks, treasure hunting happens in the rural areas. But even in the cases that they are caught, it's not considered as a serious crime. And in certain cases, if, for instance, they are desecrating cemeteries, they could even be considered as hate crimes and should be prosecuted like that. But those cases never end up in there. And we have actually not been able to identify any perpetrators of this kind of treasure hunting in the media survey, but during our field survey, we have encountered multiple cases of treasure hunting. And in our interviews with local authorities, for instance, they were very open about the treasure hunters. Everybody knew who they were. Everybody knew of their actions, but no, there was no action against them to prosecute them.
Thank you for that, Tuba. And before we switch over to questions from the audience, I did want to see if any of our commissioners had any questions that they wanted to ask as well.
Yes, thank you. If it's all right with you, Commissioner Gelman, I'll jump in here. It seems like the report draws a distinction between what I would call the smash of these major terrorist attacks, which have gone down, and the squeeze on these minority cultures. And it sure appears to me from the report and your answering that the squeeze on religious minorities in Turkey is real, it's intense. When you see systems which fail to punish behavior, you're really encouraging it in many ways. So do you, in your opinion, based on your research and all the work you've done on these 80 sites and 7 provinces, is this as systematic as it appears, as I've stated it to you, this squeeze on these religious minorities?
It is systematic. That many religious minorities in Turkey live with an inbuilt understanding that they may not be considered as equal citizens in front of the law. So they may feel their rights are not equally protected in terms of when they're faced with these attacks. So I'm sorry to say, but you're absolutely right about your.
Help me, one further question. I don't mean to cut off Commissioner Gelman if she has a question, but help me understand what this idea about an apology being sufficient in a criminal situation. That's new to me. I know there are lots of cases in this country and other countries where people are not prosecuted because of technicalities or whatever things. I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, having been in this area for some time, religious freedom, that while I think the moral fabric of a community is important and probably needs some of these kinds of things, I don't understand why that would be sufficient in these very serious circumstances.
Let me kind of clarify this. When somebody, for instance, writes a graffiti on a church wall, and if that person is caught and brought to the police station, the police interviews him or her, and then if the person says something like, "I will never do this again, I'm so sorry, I have done this," to the community that they have done this to, the community may choose not to further prosecute the crime. It looks like it's the choice of the community, but it really is not. Because by choosing to prosecute that crime, they may put themselves in further danger of similar crimes. So it may be a choice, it may look like a choice on the community to kind of say, your apology is accepted, but it's not always the case. So, and this kind of builds up the frequency of similar attacks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I want to flag that for notice, because we can all remember situations where there were comments, things that were graffitied on the side of a synagogue or a church, which were larger statements that could incite issues endanger entire communities. So that's not a small thing, but
Absolutely.
thank you so much.
I do have a question. As you know, the USCIRF report is very comprehensive. Thank you for that and for all your efforts in researching and writing it. And there are some specific recommendations in terms of pressure that the United States can continue to bring to bear upon Turkey to really confront what you have now just described as really systemic religious persecution. I was just wondering if you want to elaborate with our audience, what kinds of particular steps and pressure points do you feel might be most effective, not just the United States, of course, but the global community? Thank you.
One recommendation is to urge the Turkish communities to stop impunity and start prosecuting crimes. And again, I am very happy that USCIRF had the funds for us to put this report. This could give solid evidence for people to use when they're talking to Turkish authorities. The second one, and I think this is a really important one, is to do with the nature of General Directorate of Foundations. In the current structure, the non-Muslim minority communities have a very hard time sustaining their communities and upkeeping their own religious sites. I would like to highlight that they have to not only upkeep, pay their clergy, pay for their expenses, and pay for their own security with the funds that comes from their foundations. And foundations have revenue generating properties. In the current system, it's very easy for the government to take over some of these revenue generating properties. There are legal mishaps and practices that can end up the community losing their revenue generating properties. And this has a very significant effect on the communities. The communities themselves have asked the government to make significant changes in the General Directorate of Pious Foundations. So US officials and others could ask for Turkey to reconsider and implement some of these changes in the General Directorate of Foundations. So those would be two. And also the third one, and in my opinion, the most important one, as my colleagues, my co-authors in this report, there are so many people in Turkey who actually want to make things better for all citizens. And there are, very strong advocates of religious freedoms, strong advocates of religious minorities, and their work needs to be supported, not only financially, but sometimes legally. If those people get persecuted, like Osman Kavala, for helping out communities, for protecting religious sites, for protecting religious heritage, if they receive if they are prosecuted for doing their good work, we should also be able to speak up for them as well.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm going to turn to some of our questions from the audience. We do have two questions that are more or less on the same subject, so I will try and combine them. What has been the impact of Hamas's October 7 terrorist attacks and the ensuing global spike in anti-Semitism on the climate of freedom of religion or belief in Turkey? What steps should Turkish authorities take to ensure the safety of Jewish individuals, institutions, and religious sites in Turkey? And has the press provoked any of these actions?
Let me also first note that our research ended at the end of 2022. Whatever I will be answering will be my own observations rather than what we have in the report. There is an uptick in anti-Semitism in Turkey over the last decade. And the recent Hamas attacks of October 7th actually has caused an environment of further fear for not only Jewish communities, but all non-Muslim communities, that extremism is becoming a lot more normalized, which is a very, very fearful trend. I have to acknowledge the Turkish government's efforts in trying to protect the Jewish community at the moment and in Turkey, but at the same time, because a lot of these smaller looking crimes are still being committed, I think the environment of fear is very much there for all non-Muslim communities.
And then we have another question about President Erdogan's role in this. So is President Erdogan on a mission to turn Turkey from a secular country to one focused on promoting Sunni Islam? And is this part of the reason why his government is suppressing other religious minorities?
This is a hard question to answer. I can only look at the results of the last 20 years to answer that. And on the one hand, some things attest to the fact that Turkey is becoming less and less inclusive and more polarized under the 2 decades of Erdogan's rule. And the minorities are, again, as I said in the beginning of this paper, are the canaries in the coal mine. And we were also able to document another trend, that a lot of the minorities in Turkey are very quickly decreasing in number. A lot of people choose to live outside of Turkey for fear of their lives and for their children's future. So the environment that the Erdogan government has created is not only dangerous for the minorities in Turkey, but also endangers the culture of living together. So the more you live together with others, the more inclusive, the more democratic you are as a country. This is why freedom of belief is so much at the heart of these discussions. If communities don't feel as they are safe, if communities don't feel that they have equal rights, they will, if they can, choose to leave the country, which makes the country a lot more monolithic and a lot less inclusive. And one of the end results of this is the increase in all sorts of extremism, including national and religious extremism.
There's another question that I believe kind of goes back to the issue we discussed on treasure hunting. Is there an increase of vandalism or destruction of ancient sites?
We don't have the data to tell you exactly whether or not there is an increase in that record, but I was trained as an archaeologist, so I follow destructions on ancient sites in Turkey quite closely, and I can tell you that the amount of destruction that we are seeing due to treasure hunting and illicit excavations is also alarming.
What role do you think nationalism plays in these attacks?
A very, very important role. And I should actually make very clear about this point, that nationalism is also a very threatening factor. And this was very clear in our multiple interviews with religious and non-believer communities, that they were the ones who actually used the word nationalism and how that kind of is creating further marginalization of them, that they, through nationalism, they were kind of cast as secondary citizens, and some people did not even consider them as citizens because they believed in a different religion. So this is actually a very important factor that contributes to all the crimes that we discussed.
Now we have what I believe is a general question. Who are the owners of these religious sites in Turkey? And then a methodological question. Why did you select 80 sites, and what is the percentile breakdown in terms of, do they belong to Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Muslim communities?
So we decided to choose 8 sites in each province. And depending on the province, because in Turkey, you can think about, like, for instance, if you're doing work in Southeast Anatolia or Eastern Anatolia, you have a lot more Armenian or Assyrian, Syriac sites. Or if you're doing, conducting work in other places, like in Izmir, you have a lot more Jewish sites. So this is, the choice of sites was, we tried to include at least one site of each religion, but sometimes we had more of one type of religion in one geography than others. And the other one, could you remind me the beginning of the question?
The other one was, let me see, what was the percentage breakdown of the 80 sites that were selected for the survey?
Oh, again, we selected 10 sites in each province. Oh, I remember who are the owners of these sites. That is actually an amazing and very important question. Because when you are the owner of the site as the community, you have a lot more say on the future of that site, right? Like, for instance, this Syriacs in Southeast Turkey have lost a very large number of sites, over 100 sites, to confiscation. So on the one hand, they are the clear owners of these sites, but legally they had to fight back to get their ownerships of these sites, and they were only able to do that legally to a very small percentage of the sites, most of which were religious in function and not the revenue generating properties. So and this is one of the most important issues when we come to the structure of General Directorate of Foundations, that it is the institution through which minority communities are organized. Thus, it is the institution through which you can actually assess your ownership of the site and sometimes lose the sites. So this is a very important question to consider, yes.
And we have another question from the audience asking why the report didn't cover any confiscations impacting the Gulen community, as well as any impact of the Syrian refugee influx on these issues.
Those were questions we did not include. And we wanted to include especially the Syrian refugees and how this very new and very large minority in Turkish society is affecting. But at the moment, we could not identify religious sites that they had. If we did this report maybe 10 years down the line, we would probably have religious sites that they were using or being part of. So it's probably an issue of when we did the report and research.
I think we'll have time for one last question. So going back to the subject of government restoration efforts, under what circumstances do authorities decide to protect and preserve a particular site? And do those religious communities themselves have the means or the ability to petition the government to restore their own sites? And what, in your views, are the most significant benefits of these restoration efforts?
There are some really good examples of government working with the communities to restore a community's religious site. And there are some other examples in which the government's efforts were not necessarily planned in the best way. For instance, one of the best examples I can think of is the Grand Synagogue of Edirne, in which the Jewish community kind of can host religious rituals and worship at the site occasionally, even though there is no living Jewish community in Edirne at the moment. The presence of Jewish community in that region, when they're doing, when they're conducting their rituals, the whole community embraced them because of how well the planning was done and how well the community has an interaction with the site. And there are other sites that have been restored, but sometimes converted into other uses. For instance, turned into a church being turned into a library or a cultural center and things like that. In these cases, there are conflicting opinions. On the one hand, some of the communities say that it's better that they restore it and preserve the memory in whatever shape and form it exists. But on the other hand, some feel that this is kind of like a desecration of the space, and they do not approve of. But in general, most of the restorations that were either done by the government or with government support had a positive impact in the regions. One thing that I would urge US officials and others to remind the Turkish government is that the communities themselves should also have the right to restore their own heritage and open it up to worship, open it for worship. There is, for instance, a case in Bursa in which the Greek Orthodox community purchased 2 churches to be restored. And we interviewed the community in Bursa, the local Muslim community. Our impression was that they were looking forward to it, actually. They were very open for this restoration to take place. But from what I understand, there has been multiple impediments in the bureaucracy as this process is going. For instance, it would be wonderful if the Turkish government supported projects like these when the religious communities wanted to take back their religious sites and restore them for worship and other uses.
So we are quickly coming up on the end of our hour. So I just wanted to ask both Dr. Tanya Erdemir as well as our commissioners if they had any final thoughts or comments that they would like to share before we close.
I would just like to say thank you so much for this great report. It's fascinating, a very important subject.
And I just want to echo Commissioner Curry's thanks to our expert and to our staff and to everyone who joined us today. Thank you so much for your interest in this very significant issue. Thank you so much.
And let me thank USCIRF for realizing the importance of this issue. Thank you.
Well, and I would like to thank USCIRF Commissioners David Curry and Susie Gelman for leading today's conversation on threats to religious sites in Turkey. I'd also like to express our gratitude to Dr. Tuba Tanya Erdemir and the Turkey-based team, both for authoring this important report and participating in this discussion. And lastly, I'd also like to thank Danielle Ashbahian, Veronica McCarthy, and Jamie Staley for their help also in supporting today's conversation. If you would like to learn more about USCIRF's work, please visit our website at www.uscirf.gov. We look forward to hosting similar conversations in the future, so please stay tuned. We have also dropped the link to the report that was the subject of today's discussion in the chat, and you can find it on our website. So thank you again for joining, and we hope to see you next time.